Can we still listen to Michael Jackson? Should we still read J.K. Rowling? Do Kevin Spacey movies deserve to disappear? What do we do with Picasso? Should colleges still teach Wagner? What about Kanye West, or Harvey Weinstein, or Thomas Jefferson? These conversations seem to happen almost weekly now. Some artist, public figure, or historical icon says or does something reprehensible. Or perhaps we simply learn something disturbing about them after the fact. And suddenly, society finds itself renegotiating its relationship with their work. Can I still enjoy this song? Can I still admire this building? Can I still watch this film? Welcome to At The Vanguard. I'm Christopher Lloyd Bratten-Zappala, and in this episode, I want to explore the often challenging topic of separating the art from the artist. There's something that frequently gets lost in these conversations. There are actually three entirely different questions embedded in this topic. The first two are easy. The last one, not so much. The first question is, can we separate the art from the artist? Psychologically speaking, yes. Human beings do this constantly. We engage with anonymous art all the time. We reinterpret works independently of authorial intent. We connect deeply with music, stories, films, paintings, philosophies, and inventions created by people we know nothing about, or even people we actively dislike. The second question is, do we separate the art from the artist? Again, clearly yes. Society already does this, albeit selectively and inconsistently. We are often more forgiving of dead artists than living ones, more forgiving of artists we grew up with, artists whose work means something personal to us, people who share our politics, our values, our tribe, our identity. Time matters, proximity matters, power matters, emotion matters, and bias matters. But the third question, this is where things become genuinely difficult and philosophically interesting. Should we separate the art from the artist? This is the moral facet, and the one I think most people are concerned with. My answer is, generally speaking, yes. We should strive to separate the art from the artist. I want to be very clear about what I mean by that, because this topic has become emotionally radioactive, morally loaded, and intellectually muddy. I am not saying artists should escape accountability. I am not saying all art is harmless. I am not saying context is irrelevant. I'm not saying trauma isn't real. And I am certainly not saying we owe our support, money, or admiration to morally corrupt people simply because they created something beautiful. What I am saying is this. As a guiding principle, maintaining the distinction between art and artist generally leads to clearer thinking, fairer judgment, greater cultural resilience, and greater human flourishing than collapsing them into one moral object. Because once we begin conflating things, artist, artwork, morality, politics, identity, emotion, biography, audience reaction, our ability to think clearly deteriorates very quickly. Now, some people hearing this may already feel uncomfortable. Honestly, I think that's good. Discomfort is appropriate here. These are not simple questions. And I want to make something else clear before we continue. This episode is not about defending abusive people. It's not about excusing criminal behavior, and it's not about minimizing harm. If anything, I would argue the opposite. Conflating art and artist can actually impair moral judgment rather than strengthen it. Because once everything collapses together, we stop evaluating things precisely. We stop distinguishing between the work and the creator, the institution, the audience, the system surrounding them. Everything becomes contaminated. Everything becomes symbolic. Everything becomes emotionally fused. And when that happens, nuance starts to die. I know some people dislike the word nuance because it's often used as camouflage for cowardice or moral evasiveness. But that's not what I mean here. Nuance is not moral weakness or indecision or neutrality. Nuance is the willingness to contend honestly with complexity, rather than flatten reality into emotionally satisfying binaries. And human beings are complex. History is complex. Art is complex. Civilization is complex. The artist who creates transcendent beauty may also be selfish, cruel, manipulative, exploitative, narcissistic, abusive, cowardly, prejudiced, or deeply psychologically damaged. In fact, if we're being honest, moral imperfection is not the exception in human history, it's the norm. And that raises the question, if moral imperfection disqualifies human creation from meaningful engagement, what exactly survives? Because once you start applying a sort of contamination logic consistently, almost everything begins to collapse. The philosophers, the composers, the filmmakers, the painters, the scientists, the politicians, the inventors, the religious leaders, the nations, the institutions, the movements. If immorality contaminates anything it touches, human civilization itself becomes radioactive. And that should force us to pause for a moment and ask whether such a framework itself is flawed. Not because morality doesn't matter, but because the desire for moral purification can become corrosive in its own right. One of the deepest problems in modern discourse is that we frequently struggle to hold two truths simultaneously. That a person can create something beautiful and be morally reprehensible. That art can possess genuine value independent of its creator. That context matters without becoming destiny. That accountability matters without requiring erasure. That preserving something is not the same as celebrating it. That understanding something is not the same as endorsing it. And that clarity is better than conflation. Ultimately, that's what this episode is really about. Not just art, not just celebrity scandals and cancel culture, but the importance of differentiation itself. The ability to distinguish between things carefully, consciously, and honestly. That ability is one of the hallmarks of a mature civilization. When certain people hear the phrase, separate the art from the artist, they often hear one of several things. Stop caring about morality. Just ignore abuse. Artists should get a free pass because they're talented. Beautiful art excuses ugly behavior. Or perhaps, you're just trying to preserve your own comfort while avoiding moral responsibility. None of that is my position. In fact, one of the reasons these conversations become so dysfunctional is because we collapse too many things together emotionally and conceptually. The artwork, the artist, the audience, the industry, the financial systems, the institutions, the victims, the moral transgression, the cultural legacy, the legal consequences, the emotional response. These are all related, but they're not identical. And when we fail to distinguish between related things, our thinking becomes muddy. So let me try to define my position as clearly as possible. This is it in a nutshell. I believe a work of art should be judged on its own merit. That's it. Not in total isolation from context, not stripped of all history, and not removed from interpretation, but evaluated as a distinct entity rather than as a morally fused extension of its creator. Because once we start merging artist and artwork into a single moral object, we create all sorts of philosophical and practical problems. For example, suppose someone chooses not to listen to R. Kelly because they don't want to financially support him. That is a coherent moral choice. But that is a different claim from saying the music itself is morally indistinguishable from the man. Those are not the same argument. Likewise, someone may decide never again to watch a film associated with Harvey Weinstein. By all means, that's their right. But should the performances, cinematography, screenwriting, directing, editing, music, and artistic achievements of hundreds of other people involved in those films suddenly become morally invalid because of one man's actions? I don't think so. And I think we intuitively understand this distinction in many other areas of life. We generally do not believe children inherit moral guilt from their parents. We generally don't destroy buildings because the architect turned out to be morally compromised. We generally don't discard scientific discoveries because the scientist was personally flawed. We are capable of understanding influence without confusing it with identity. And yet, when it comes to art, current discourse increasingly gravitates toward what I call contamination thinking. Once an artist becomes morally tainted, the work itself begins to feel tainted. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I am not saying this emotional response is unnatural. Rather, it is deeply human. Human beings are symbolic creatures. We attach meaning emotionally. We form associations. Context changes perception. Learning disturbing information about someone can absolutely alter our experience of their work. I completely understand all that. What I'm questioning is whether that altered perception should become our guiding philosophical principle. Because there's a major difference between I now experience this work differently and therefore the work itself has become morally corrupted. Those are not equivalent statements. And failing to distinguish between them creates serious problems. For instance, if a work of art is contaminated by the transgressions of its creator, what exactly does that mean? Is the contamination permanent? Can redemption occur? What about works created before the wrongdoing? What about artists who genuinely reform? What about historical figures judged by modern standards? Or art whose meaning radically changes over time? What about collaborative works involving dozens or hundreds of people? Or works whose creators are anonymous? The more you press on this sort of contamination logic, the more unstable it becomes. And part of the instability comes from the fact that we're often invoking quasi-religious concepts without realizing it. Taint, corruption, purity, stain, contamination. These are almost theological concepts. And once those concepts enter the conversation, moral reasoning starts to drift away from discernment and toward purification rituals, toward symbolic cleansing, toward erasure, toward the fantasy that if we can just eliminate all morally compromised art and artists from our environment, we ourselves might somehow become cleaner. But human civilization doesn't work that way. Human beings don't work that way. History doesn't work that way. And art certainly doesn't work that way. Because art has always emerged from flawed human beings. Always. The painter, the composer, the activist, the inventor, the saint, the scientist. Human greatness and human brokenness have always coexisted uneasily inside the same species. And perhaps part of maturity is learning how to confront that reality without succumbing to either blind worship or total condemnation. Now, to be clear, none of this means anything goes. There absolutely is such a thing as morally reprehensible art. There is propaganda. There is dehumanizing art. There is exploitative art. There is art that glorifies cruelty, domination, hatred, or abuse. And in those cases, I believe the artwork itself should be judged accordingly, because the moral issue is actually present within the work. That's the important distinction. An immoral artist does not automatically create immoral art. And conversely, a morally admirable person is fully capable of creating shallow, manipulative, or even destructive art. At the end of the day, the work still has to stand on its own. Preserving that distinction ultimately protects morality more than if we collapse everything together. Because when everything becomes morally fused, precision disappears. And without precision, justice becomes unstable. Without precision, outrage becomes arbitrary. Without precision, we stop evaluating things carefully and start reacting symbolically. I want to spend a little time now on this idea of contamination, because I think it sits at the heart of the entire discussion. What exactly are we saying when we claim that a work of art has become tainted or such by its creator? What does that actually mean? Where is the contamination located? How does it function? How is it transmitted? Can it spread retroactively? Can it be cleansed? Can redemption occur? Or is it permanent? And importantly, who decides? I'm not intending to be flippant here, because once we begin pressing on these questions, the framework starts to wobble. Take a simple example. Suppose an artist creates a body of work over 20 years. Then, late in life, they commit some terrible act. Are all previous works now morally compromised, retroactively? If so, how? Did the artwork itself change? Did the notes in the symphony rearrange themselves? Did the paint chemically alter? Did the architecture become structurally immoral overnight? Or did our perception change? Human beings are contextual creatures. Learning disturbing things about someone absolutely changes how we emotionally engage with their work. But emotional association is not the same thing as objective transformation. Conflating those two categories creates a tremendous amount of confusion. Let me put it differently. Suppose you hear a song for the first time. You know absolutely nothing about the artist. You find the song beautiful, moving, profound. It genuinely enriches your experience of life. Then, a week later, you discover the artist did something awful. Suddenly the song feels different. Okay. But what exactly changed? Not the song. You changed. Or more precisely, your interpretive framework changed. New information entered your consciousness and altered your emotional relationship to the work. That is psychologically real, but it does not necessarily follow that the moral corruption now exists inherently within the artwork itself. That distinction matters, because if a moral quality is entirely imperceptible within the work, absent biographical knowledge, then we should at least consider the possibility that the contamination is being cognitively imported by the observer rather than intrinsically manifested within the artwork. Now, some people may hear that and think I'm advocating for some kind of sterile formalism. as though art exists in a vacuum. I am not. Context absolutely does matter. History matters, interpretation matters. The life of the artist can absolutely deepen, complicate, or alter our understanding of a work. However, contextualization is not the same thing as conflation. That's the distinction I keep returning to. We get into trouble when we stop distinguishing between interpretation, association, symbolism, emotional reaction, and the actual content of the work itself. There is such a thing as morally corrupt art. If a work genuinely promotes dehumanization, glorifies cruelty, advocates genocide, eroticizes exploitation, or functions as propaganda, then yes, we should judge the work accordingly. Because the moral issue is actually present within the art. If the anti-Semitism is genuinely in the music, then criticize the music. If the racism is genuinely in the film, then criticize the film. If the exploitation is genuinely in the artwork, then evaluate the artwork on those grounds. But that is fundamentally different from saying the artist committed wrongdoing, therefore the work itself has become morally radioactive. Those are separate claims, and we tend to blur them. One objection people might raise here is, but the artwork is an extension of the artist. It emerged from their psychology, worldview, values, and desires. That's fair. Of course, artists shape their work. However, human beings are not morally singular creatures. That's part of the problem. We speak about people as though they possess some unified moral essence that permeates everything they touch. But human beings are contradictory. We are fragmented, dynamic, contextual. A person who does something cruel can also create tenderness. A person who behaves selfishly can also create beauty. A wounded person can create wisdom. A morally compromised person can create something that genuinely elevates humanity. And conversely, a kind person can create manipulative propaganda. A politically righteous person can create terrible art. Good intentions can produce destructive outcomes. Point being, human beings are messy. So when people speak about a kind of contamination as though the artist's moral failures simply seep into every aspect of the work like some metaphysical toxin, I become skeptical. Because it starts to resemble magical thinking more than rigorous moral reasoning. And the framework becomes even harder to sustain once we consider redemption. Suppose a violent criminal completely reforms their life. They genuinely atone. They become compassionate, wise, transformed. Then they create profound works of art from this new chapter of their life. Are those works corrupted? If so, then what exactly do we mean by redemption? Can a human being ever transcend their past? Or are people morally frozen forever? And if this contamination is not permanent, then who determines when purification occurs? What counts as sufficient atonement? Who has the authority to restore legitimacy? Or imagine the converse. Suppose a violent criminal creates profound works of art during the darkest chapter of their life, during the very years in which they were dangerous, destructive, immoral, perhaps even monstrous. Then, later in life, they genuinely transform. They take responsibility, they develop wisdom, compassion, humility. They spend decades trying to repair the damage they caused. What happens to the artwork? Is it permanently degraded because of the psychological state in which it was created? Does redemption retroactively cleanse the work? Or does the stain remain forever? And if it remains forever, then what exactly are we saying about human beings? That transformation is ultimately meaningless? That no amount of growth can alter the moral status of what one creates? That a person's worst chapter possesses permanent metaphysical authority over everything attached to them? I don't think most people actually believe that once they sit with it long enough, nor would they themselves want to be held to that standard. And yet, contamination logic quietly pushes us in that direction. You see how unstable this becomes. And that instability grows even larger once we start applying this faulty logic consistently across history. Because if moral imperfection invalidates artistic or intellectual inheritance, then what survives? Do we discard the Declaration of Independence because Thomas Jefferson owned slaves? Do we boycott the telephone because Alexander Graham Bell's views related to eugenics and deaf culture? Do we stop teaching Pablo Picasso because his treatment of women? Do we remove Richard Wagner from concert halls because of his anti-Semitism? Do we demolish buildings designed by morally compromised architects? Do we refute a philosopher's ideas because he held reprehensible views by modern standards? And if not, why not? If we're going to retain our founding document and phones and Wagner's music, how do we justify that? Where exactly is the line? Who draws it? And by what consistent principle? Now, I want to clarify, I am not arguing that all responses should be identical. Far from it. People are different. Trauma is real. History matters. Personal experience matters. Moral conscience matters. One person may choose never to engage with a particular artist again. Another may continue engaging with the work while condemning the creator. Another may separate easily. Another may struggle profoundly. I understand all of that. What I'm defending is not emotional uniformity. I'm defending conceptual differentiation. Because I believe differentiation leads to clearer thought, fairer judgment, greater resilience, and ultimately greater human flourishing than contamination-based thinking. One of the reasons this conversation matters so much to me is because I don't believe art is disposable. Art isn't merely content. It's not just entertainment or commerce or self-expression or ideology or distraction. Art is one of the primary ways human beings make meaning out of existence. Art is how humanity speaks to itself across time. And because of that, we should be extraordinarily careful about adopting cultural frameworks that incentivize erasure, purification, or fear. Because once indiscriminate moralizing becomes dominant, the effects ripple outward far beyond a handful of celebrity scandals. Artists begin self-censoring. Institutions become risk-averse. Complexity becomes dangerous. Ambiguity becomes suspicious. Moral perfection becomes an implicit prerequisite for cultural legitimacy. And eventually, the entire ecosystem of art becomes thinner, safer, flatter, more sterile, less alive. To be clear, I am not romanticizing suffering or saying offensive equals good. Some people hear arguments like this and immediately assume the alternative to censorship is chaos or rampant depravity. It's not. I'm talking about resilience. I'm talking about cultural robustness. I'm talking about whether a civilization possesses the psychological and intellectual strength to confront difficult ideas, difficult histories, difficult people, and difficult art without either devolving into fragility or retreating into authoritarian purification. Because healthy ecosystems are not sterile. They are dynamic, adaptive, complex, organic. And art works the same way. Art feeds on itself. Every generation absorbs, transforms, critiques, rejects, remixes, and reinterprets the generations before it. Even bad art has value. Even failed art has value. Even dangerous art has value. Not necessarily a celebration, but as warning, insight, historical evidence, psychological revelation, cultural artifact. We study propaganda not because we endorse it, but because we need to understand it. We preserve the atrocities of history not because we glorify them, but because forgetting them makes us weaker and more vulnerable. We don't place Nazi propaganda on giant public billboards and say, "Here, enjoy this." We contextualize it. We study it critically. We place it in museums. We examine how human beings became capable of producing and believing such things. That is stewardship. That's maturity. There's a profound difference between preservation, contextualization, engagement, and celebration. To preserve something is not necessarily to endorse it. To understand something is not necessarily to admire it. To engage with something is not necessarily to become corrupted by it. And this confusion reveals something deeper about our current cultural psychology. We increasingly distrust human beings' ability to contend with complexity. We increasingly behave as though exposure itself is inherently dangerous, as though the mind is so fragile that encountering morally compromised art will automatically infect us. That is a deeply unhealthy trajectory. Because civilizations become strong not by eliminating every difficult thing from the environment, but by developing the capacity to confront difficulty intelligently. The immune system analogy comes to mind here. An immune system doesn't become stronger by eliminating all contact with bacteria and stressors and pathogens and foreign material. In fact, excessive sterilization can weaken the organism itself. Similarly, a culture that attempts to sanitize itself into moral purity may gradually lose resilience, courage, ambiguity tolerance, interpretive sophistication, artistic daring, and psychological robustness. It becomes brittle, fearful, performative, homogenized. We are already seeing signs of that brittleness. People are terrified to say the wrong thing. Artists are averse to complexity. Institutions are allergic to nuance. Audiences are increasingly conditioned to interpret art primarily through ideological or moral suspicion rather than curiosity, wonder, exploration, or contradiction. Something precious dies when that happens. Vitality, electricity, creative risk, the sense that art is allowed to explore the full terrain of human existence, including its darkness. Because art has never merely reflected human perfection. Art reflects humanity, and humanity contains beauty, cruelty, tenderness, violence, selfishness and love, hatred, confusion, aspiration, despair, and contradiction. If art loses the freedom to honestly contend with those realities, then it ceases to function as humanity's mirror, as its conscience, as its key to a meaningful existence. It becomes propaganda, or branding, or anesthesia, or moral theater. One of the reasons people become drawn toward purification culture is because uncertainty is exhausting. Nuance is difficult. Contradiction is uncomfortable. It is psychologically easier to divide the world into pure and impure, safe and unsafe, good people and bad people, approved art and condemned art. But reality stubbornly refuses to cooperate with those binaries. Human beings are too complicated for them. History is too complicated for them. And art is certainly too complicated for them. Which means a mature civilization must develop something more difficult than purification. Discernment. The ability to confront complexity without slipping into either blind worship or total condemnation. That ability is one of the prerequisites for cultural adulthood. At this point, some may be thinking, okay, fine, philosophically interesting, but what about power? And honestly, I think that's one of the strongest objections in this entire conversation. Because art doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists inside systems. economic systems, celebrity systems, institutional systems, media systems, and power systems. And critics of separating the art from the artist are absolutely correct about something important. Sometimes continued engagement with art materially benefits harmful people. Streaming a song can generate revenue. Buying tickets can expand influence. Awards can rehabilitate reputation. Institutions can protect abusive artists because their work is profitable or culturally prestigious. That's all real. And any serious discussion of this topic has to acknowledge that reality honestly rather than pretending it doesn't exist. But I still believe the cleaner and more just solution is not to collapse art and artists into one moral object. The better solution is differentiated accountability, meaning hold the guilty entity accountable directly. Punish the abuser, reform the institution, change the financial structure, update the legal framework, protect victims, increase transparency, establish consequences. None of that requires pretending the artwork itself committed a crime. Because once we start treating all associated cultural products as morally fused with the transgressor, accountability becomes diffuse, symbolic, and performative rather than precise. And precision matters. Imagine two different approaches. In the first approach, society says, this artist committed wrongdoing, therefore, all associated art must be erased, hidden, condemned, or morally contaminated forever. In the second approach, society says, this artist committed wrongdoing, therefore, the artists themselves should face appropriate legal, financial, institutional, and social consequences, while the artwork continues to be evaluated independently. The second framework is simply more coherent, more precise, more equitable, and frankly more mature. I know someone may object, but continuing to celebrate the work still elevates the artist symbolically. That's a fair point. And this is where we need to separate a few things that are often blended together: appreciation, patronage, canonization, institutional endorsement, and celebrity worship. These are not identical. You can acknowledge that a film is extraordinary without wanting its creator celebrated as a moral role model. You can preserve a work historically without glorifying the person who made it. You can study someone's contribution while simultaneously condemning aspects of their behavior. In fact, I would argue that maintaining this distinction may actually improve accountability, because once we stop worshiping artists as saints, we become less psychologically invested in protecting them. That's an unfortunate consequence of artist worship culture. The more tightly we fuse genius, identity, morality, and artistic value, the more destabilizing it becomes when artists fail morally. And human beings will fail morally, repeatedly. So perhaps one solution is to stop demanding moral perfection from creators in the first place. Not because morality is irrelevant, but because art and moral sainthood are different categories. One of the strangest modern tendencies is the expectation that artists simultaneously be brilliant, psychologically healthy, ethically exemplary, politically aligned, emotionally mature, socially informed, spiritually evolved, and culturally flawless. That's an impossible standard, and historically it has never been true. Many artists are deeply fractured people. Some are narcissistic, some are self-destructive, some are emotionally stunted or psychologically chaotic or morally compromised. Some are deeply compassionate, some are wise. Most are mixtures because they're human beings. And one of the dangers of moral purification culture is that it creates impossible standards publicly while encouraging hypocrisy privately. When we can't be honest with ourselves and with each other, we begin to selectively apply principles based on tribal affiliation or emotional attachment or political alignment, usefulness, nostalgia, popularity, or social pressure, which means accountability becomes inconsistent. One artist is permanently condemned, another receives forgiveness. One historical figure is contextualized, another is erased. One institution apologizes, another quietly avoids scrutiny. One artist's flaws become disqualifying, another artist's flaws become complicated. I think most people already recognize this inconsistency intuitively. The standards drift constantly because the framework itself is unstable. Again, I am not arguing for moral indifference. I'm not saying nothing matters. Quite the opposite. Morality matters enormously, which is precisely why I believe accountability should become more precise rather than more emotionally confused. If an artist commits a crime, hold them accountable. If an institution enabled abuse, hold it accountable. If victims need support, support them. If financial systems incentivize exploitation, change them. But if the artwork itself contains beauty, insight, meaning, transcendence, or genuine artistic value, destroying our relationship to the work doesn't serve justice. In some cases, it may actually impoverish us culturally while doing very little to meaningfully address the underlying problem. Symbolic purification is often much easier than structural reform. It's easier to delete a song from a playlist than to fix an institution. Easier to denounce a filmmaker online than to build healthier systems. Easier to perform moral outrage than to create actual justice. And modern culture sometimes confuses symbolic moral gestures with meaningful moral action. At this point, I want to acknowledge something important. Everything I've said so far exists at the level of philosophy, principles, systems, and culture. But human beings don't live only at the level of philosophy. We live emotionally, relationally, biographically, embodied. And any serious conversation about this topic has to make room for that reality. Because for many people, separating the art from the artist is not merely an intellectual exercise. It's deeply personal, sometimes painfully so. A particular song may remind someone of abuse. A film may become emotionally unbearable after learning disturbing information about its creator. An artist's behavior may radically alter someone's relationship to work that once meant a great deal to them. And I want to be very clear. I don't think those emotional responses are irrational. I don't think they're fake. I don't think they should simply be dismissed with detached intellectualism. Human beings form associations. Meanings change with context. Experience shapes perception. That's part of being human. So when I defend the distinction between art and artist, I am not arguing that everyone should experience art identically. I'm not saying you must continue enjoying this, or you are morally obligated to consume this work. And I'm certainly not saying if you can't separate them emotionally, you are weak or wrong. That is not my position. What I am saying is something much subtler. There is a difference between acknowledging emotional difficulty and abandoning conceptual distinction. For example, someone may say, I personally cannot listen to this artist anymore without distress. That is totally understandable. But that's a different claim from, therefore, the artwork itself has become inherently corrupt and no one should engage with it. Human flourishing doesn't come from eliminating all discomfort from existence. It comes from developing greater capacity, greater resilience, greater discernment, greater freedom. At the core of all of this is the question of agency, the ability to choose, the ability to engage consciously rather than react compulsively. If someone chooses not to engage with certain art because of conscience, trauma, disgust, grief, or moral conviction, that is their right. Absolutely. But I would argue there is still something valuable about possessing the capacity to distinguish between the work and the creator, even if one ultimately chooses disengagement. Because capacity expands freedom. Incapacity constricts it. And sometimes our culture unintentionally romanticizes psychological incapacity in ways that ultimately diminish human possibility. Compassion, accommodation, understanding, these are vital. But accommodation is not the same thing as idealization. For example, society routinely creates accommodations for human limitations without restructuring all of reality around those limitations. We build wheelchair ramps, we create allergy medicine, we develop therapeutic tools, we support mental health treatment, we acknowledge vulnerability while still preserving a functioning shared world. Something similar applies here. A healthy society should be able to make room for trauma, grief, moral conscience, emotional complexity, and differing capacities. But the existence of emotional difficulty doesn't mean we should ignore distinctions, erase complexity, or abandon aspirational principles altogether. Because human beings are capable of growth. We are capable of developing greater resilience, greater wisdom, interpretive sophistication, emotional regulation. And no, I don't mean emotional suppression. Modern culture often confuses resilience with numbness. Resilience is not numbness. It's not indifference or emotional sterility. In many ways, it's the opposite. Resilience is greater emotional range, greater flexibility, greater capacity to encounter reality without fragmentation. What I'm advocating for here is not less feeling, but more mature feeling, more integrated feeling. Feeling that's governed not only by impulse or symbolic association, but by reflection, discernment, context, and conscious choice. Reality is complicated. Human beings are complicated. And if our emotional world becomes so rigid that we can't encounter complexity without recoiling into purification or avoidance, then something incredibly valuable gets lost. Freedom. The freedom to think clearly, the freedom to engage consciously, the freedom to distinguish between categories carefully, the freedom to decide rather than merely react. And that freedom is deeply connected to human flourishing. Now, again, I want to emphasize, none of this means everyone must arrive at the same conclusion. Some people will continue engaging with certain art, others will disengage with it entirely. Some will fluctuate over time. Some relationships to works of art will heal, others won't. That's all part of being human. But a mature society strives to cultivate discernment over conflation, capacity over fragility, understanding over simplification, and conscious choice over reflexive thinking. Underneath this entire conversation lies a deeper question that humanity often struggles to articulate clearly. What is art, really? Not commercially or legally or algorithmically. What is art philosophically, spiritually, existentially? In my opinion, art can never be fully defined. I've never liked rigid definitions of art because I think the openness is part of the point. The question, what is art, itself remains alive because it's never answered. Human beings continue participating in the evolution of meaning. However we might define it, art occupies a uniquely sacred place in human existence. My personal philosophy identifies 4 foundational pillars of human flourishing: mindfulness, compassion, wisdom, and art. Mindfulness helps us understand ourselves. Compassion helps us understand each other. Wisdom helps us understand reality. And art helps us understand meaning. Art is how human beings create meaning out of machinery, out of matter, out of chaos, out of suffering. Art is how consciousnesses reach beyond survival and ask, why? Why love? Why endure? Why sacrifice? Why continue? Why hope? Why create? And because of that, art deserves extraordinary care. Not worship of artists or blind allegiance, not immunity from criticism, but reverence for the role art itself plays in human civilization. Art is one of the primary ways humanity remembers itself. A painting can outlive an empire. A song can survive generations. A novel can preserve an emotional truth longer than political systems survive. A film can shape how millions imagine humanity itself. Art becomes part of the ongoing conversation between the living, the dead, and the unborn. And that conversation has never been conducted by morally perfect people. Never. The history of art is not the history of saints. It is the history of human beings, broken human beings, searching human beings, contradictory, brilliant, and wounded human beings. And somehow, through all that imperfection, humanity has still managed to create astonishing beauty. Beauty that's capable of comforting grief, inspiring courage, cultivating empathy, transmitting wisdom, revealing truth, and transforming lives. That matters profoundly. And one of the dangers of this moral purification culture is that it risks teaching people to approach art with suspicion rather than wonder, to scan for impurity before meaning, to prioritize moral signaling over honest engagement, to flatten the experience of art into ideological sorting. And something deeply human disappears when that happens. Art is not merely informational, it is transformational, or at least it can be. A piece of music can alter the emotional texture of a human life. A novel can awaken moral imagination. A film can help heal trauma. A painting can make existence itself feel more luminous. A play can expose truths we were psychologically unable to confront directly. Art enlarges consciousness. And yes, art can also harm. It can manipulate. Propaganda exists, exploitative art exists, cruel art exists. But I would argue the answer to dangerous art is not cultural sterilization. It's stewardship, discernment, education, contextualization, maturity. When society loses confidence in its ability to engage with difficult art intelligently, it loses confidence in its ability to engage with difficult reality at all. And reality is difficult. Human beings are difficult. History is difficult. That difficulty cannot simply be purified away, nor should it be. There is something powerful about humanity's ability to encounter darkness consciously rather than merely hide from it. Not to glorify it or romanticize it, but to understand it, to integrate it, to learn from it, to transform through it. This is one of the reasons art remains indispensable. Art allows us to metabolize our existence, to encounter terror safely, to encounter grief communally, to encounter ambiguity symbolically, to encounter ourselves honestly. And when people reduce art to content or branding or ideology or moral signaling, they diminish one of humanity's most extraordinary capacities, the capacity to transcend mere survival. Because ultimately, art is how human beings push back against meaninglessness. It's how we refuse to become purely mechanical creatures, how we insist that existence contains depth, mystery, soul. That's why I feel so strongly about protecting art from simplistic moral collapse. Not because artists are sacred. They aren't. Artists are human beings, flawed human beings, often deeply flawed. But art itself occupies a different category, or at least it should. Because if we lose our ability to engage with art courageously, honestly, and discerningly, if every work must first pass through a constantly shifting purity filter before it may meaningfully exist, then eventually the conversation between humanity and itself begins to shrink. And that would represent a genuine civilizational loss, not just aesthetically, but also spiritually and existentially. Because if we were ever to truly lose art, we would be turning the lights out on human existence. So let's return to the three questions we began with. Can we separate art from the artist? Yes, human beings are clearly capable. We already do it, though often inconsistently and unconsciously. Do we separate the art from the artist? Again, yes. Look around. We do it selectively, emotionally, tribally, sometimes generously, sometimes harshly, sometimes hypocritically. Which brings us back to the real question. Should we? I believe, generally speaking, we should strive to. Not because context doesn't matter, not because morality doesn't matter, and certainly not because artists deserve worship or immunity from accountability, but because maintaining the distinction between art and artist generally produces clearer thinking, fairer judgment, and greater cultural resilience, and greater human flourishing. Which brings us back to the real question, should we? I believe, generally speaking, we should strive to. Not because context doesn't matter, not because morality doesn't matter, and certainly not because artists deserve worship or immunity from accountability, but because maintaining the distinction between art and artist generally produces clearer thinking, fairer judgment, greater cultural resilience, and greater human flourishing than collapsing them into one moral object. And that distinction matters far beyond art. It touches something fundamental about how we navigate reality itself. Whether we are capable of holding complexity without succumbing to simplification, whether we can distinguish between understanding and endorsement, whether we can contextualize instead of erase, preserving without glorifying, confront moral imperfection instead of demand purification, engage with difficult realities, and not retreat into symbolic cleansing rituals, and remain open to nuance in an age increasingly hostile to it. Nuance is difficult. Discernment is difficult. Maturity is difficult. It's much easier to divide the world into good people and bad people, safe art and dangerous art, purity and immorality. But reality resists those categories. Human beings are not morally singular creatures. Neither are civilizations or history. And art, perhaps more than anything else, reflects that complexity back to us. Sometimes beautifully, sometimes painfully, sometimes uncomfortably, but always honestly. And honesty is vital. One of the great temptations is to simplify reality until it becomes emotionally manageable, to reduce ambiguity, contradiction, tension, uncertainty. But there's a danger in oversimplification. A culture can lose its capacity for discernment and for courage. We can become so obsessed with symbolic purity that we lose contact with humanity itself. Because humanity is not pure. It never has been. Human civilization was built by flawed people. Our philosophies, our nations, our inventions, our religions and institutions, and our works of art all emerged from morally imperfect human beings struggling through history. And despite that imperfection, humanity has still managed to create extraordinary beauty. Beauty worth preserving and wrestling with and learning from. Not because beauty excuses evil, it doesn't, but because beauty still matters even when imperfect people create it. Part of wisdom is learning how to hold both truths simultaneously. That a person can create greatness and still fail morally. That accountability matters, that context matters, that suffering matters, and that art matters too. Profoundly. Again, none of this means everyone must arrive at the same personal choices. Some people will stop engaging with certain artists entirely, others won't. Some relationships to art will fracture permanently, others will evolve over time. That's human. A mature society makes room for that plurality. What concerns me more is when we lose the distinction itself, when we stop differentiating carefully, when we collapse art and artist and audience and morality and ideology and emotion and identity into one fused symbolic object. Because once that happens, clarity deteriorates, and without clarity, justice becomes unstable, culture becomes brittle, art becomes fearful, and discourse becomes increasingly incapable of handling complexity. We need the opposite right now. We need more nuance, more discernment, more courage, more humility, more contextual thinking, more willingness to confront reality honestly than ritualistically. Not less morality, better morality. Not less feeling, more mature feeling. Not less accountability, more precise accountability. And ultimately, this entire conversation comes down to whether we believe human beings are capable of developing greater wisdom, greater resilience, interpretive sophistication, freedom. I believe we are. And art remains one of the primary ways we get there. Because art is one of the ways humanity speaks to itself across time. One of the ways we search for meaning together. One of the ways we transcend mere machinery and become something more fully human. And if we demand moral perfection from every voice before we allow ourselves to listen, eventually the conversation goes silent.